Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this study as we continue in our what's called our weekly Hebrew word study. We are in First Samuel chapter 22, and we're picking up with the sixth verse today, and you'll see that on your screen. And just some interesting things here. Just a little bit of examination that we look at King Saul. We know he is lost his anointing from God, and we start to see his fall morally, spiritually, um, and just what's how low he's going here. And so, pick up at verse 6. Just read a little bit of Hebrew to give you a flavor for it. Vayishma Shaul ki noda David ve'anashim asher ito ve'Shaul yoshev. And then here's interesting. It is the word Gibeah, but you'll see when it's pronounced in Hebrew, it's Begivah, Begivah. So they take some liberties when they transliterate and translate. Um, so it's in Gibeah, Begivah, and Tahat Ha'esher. So this is Ha'esher. This is interesting, and this is a tamarisk tree. Um, what's interesting here is they did not have any idea of botany, of horticulture. There were no scientific studies on what things should be called. So when you see trees and even animals themselves, we have to be just a little bit of understanding there that not to take this too much with a knowledge of how we understand trees today and how we understand animals and insects, because they did not have that same type of knowledge, and definitely not recorded in the Bible. But we gained some knowledge. So the ha'eshet, the hay in the front, is the definite article telling you that it's the tree. We translate a tree to make it better English. And so we want to unpack this, and we find very interesting here that this word is only used three times in the Hebrew Bible, and it's basically says it's from an unused word, and we really don't know what a tamarisk tree is. So they just put a name to it. But what is interesting is what it signifies. The places it's used, as we look here on the right side, we see that Abraham planted a grove of trees. The King James doesn't even translate it as tamarisk. It translates it as a grove. But we know that when Abraham did this, it was a somewhat of a mission. It was a first type of hotel and restaurant whereby travelers could come in, and Abraham would share with them his new ideas of monotheism, of the one true God. And this is very big in Jewish history, and Jewish sages talk about this, that Abraham was the first missionary for Judaism, and that his grove of tamarisk trees was a place where he glorified God and spread out his message. So that's why it's interesting when we get here in Samuel, we see it mentioned that Saul is sitting underneath it. And then if we go ahead here to First Samuel chapter 31, verse 13, we're going to find that Saul was buried underneath it along with his family later on. So this was no ordinary tree. There's a reason here that this tree was spoken about. And if we look down into the Brown Driver Briggs kind of a dictionary of Hebrew words, we're going to find that it has significance, that this had some sacredness to it, has the ability of maybe being a shrine or associated with worship. So what was Saul doing here underneath this tamarisk tree? Was he serving other gods? Was he falling into something away from the one true God. It certainly, we know that he wasn't in favor with the one true God anymore. So what was going on here? And we're going to see that this is not a nice, calm, take a rest, sip some lemonade and relaxing time, because it says that he's sitting there with his spear in his hand, and all his servants are standing around him, forming a circle of protection. This is paranoia to the max here, of a picture of paranoia on Saul's part, that he is hiding. Could it be that he is trying to worship and communicate in some way with any spiritual entity that's associated with this tree, um, and what it means to him and why he's there? So again, get the picture of Saul beneath this tree, trying to gather himself and being very, very paranoid, not just having his servants, armed servants standing around him. He's got his spear white knuckled clutched in his hand. And Vayomer Shaul Avadav Panisavim Alav Shimuna. So he says to his servants, "Hear now," um, and he starts talking to them about David, about what's going on. So yes, he's very, very paranoid. And what we see here is a leader in trouble. We see a leader who doesn't trust anyone, a leader who's trying to gain allegiance. And we're going to find here a political statement that seems to still be current today. He's saying, is David going to give every one of you vineyards and make you famous captains and of hundreds and captains of thousands? Are you going to be a big leader in his army, or are you going to stay with me? So again, it's kind of a bullying. It's somewhat of a political rhetoric. It's follow me and I will do this for you. Vote for me and I will give you, everything you need. Here we see it going on with Saul trying to rally his troops around him. And then verse 8, it even gets more um, interesting, as he says, "Have you conspired against me? And no one reveals to me that even my son Jonathan has made a covenant with David." He calls him the son of Jesse. He can't even say his name. He degrades him to just the son of Jesse. And he says, "Isn't anybody sorry for me or reveals it to me? Cholel, Collet, are you not sorry, any of you?" So here he's playing the sympathy card of, here I am, the poor king, and everybody's, turning against me, and all of you knew of all this, and you didn't reveal it to me. He's sinking deep within his own inabilities, and he's really um, scrambling here to say things that will get people loyal to him. Really, really a sad commentating here, but unfortunately, we see it. It hasn't changed. It's what people revert to when they're under pressure. It's what people revert to when they feel that they're sinking low and they're out of God's favor, out of the people's favor. They throw out all these charges. Again, here we go. So verse 9, here is where this interesting guy named Doeg comes into play. We saw him previously in an earlier chapter, and in verse 8 actually of the same chapter, and we saw that he was at the temple or tabernacle, excuse me, when David was there at the tent of meeting, and he witnessed everything. Well, here he appears and he speaks up. So Doeg the Edomite again gives his heritage. He wasn't in Israel, but yet he was at the tabernacle, and again, don't quite know why. So he spoke up and said to Saul, even though no one else was saying anything, none of his trusted servants, they were all seeing how far Saul had fallen, and their allegiance really was covered, and they weren't displaying it in the face of things here. They're caught in the middle. The one king is declining and going out. The new king hasn't taken power, so they're being very careful that they don't align themselves or misalign themselves in the king's eye and suffer his wrath. Uh, so Doeg says, okay, I saw the son of Jesse, again, doesn't mention David. He goes to Nob, and he talks to Elimelech, the priest, inquired. And here at verse 10, it says that Elimelech, the priest, inquired of the Lord, of Yahweh, for him, and gave him provisions and gave him the sword of Goliath, the Philistine. And so he ratted him out. And so we see here the king was very wrathful. And but what is interesting here is in the previous verses, it doesn't say that the priest inquired of Yahweh, inquired of the Lord for David, but obviously it happened, and we see it reiterated here, and we'll actually see that the priest does say that later on when he's called before Saul. So verse 11, Saul sends his guys, grabs Ahimelech, and the priest and all of the priests that were there, and brings them to the king. And the king starts grilling them and said, what did you do? Didn't you hear? Why have you conspired against me? And of course, these guys are innocent. They didn't know anything because David didn't tell them why he was there. He said he was on the king's errand. They didn't know that there had been this rift in the kingdom. And so they said, yeah, he came, we uh, took care of him. And, why not? We didn't know anything about it. And the king was wrathful, was very, very, very full of wrath. And he answered them and said, you know, howbeit, that I did anything wrong. Elimelech said to the king, um, none of us knew about this. And the king speaks out, Vayomer Hamelech Mot Tamut, surely you will die. And in Hebrew, it doesn't say surely. You'll notice that this word has the same number above it, 4191. So in Hebrew, when you want to emphasize it, he's really saying die to die. Die, you will die. And so that doesn't sound good in English, so it's translated as surely you will die. But in Hebrew, it's the king said, die, you will die, just to emphasize how mad he was. And so Elimelech had this pronunciation of death upon him and all of his family, the whole group that was there. And of course, this was unheard of. You don't kill the priests of the Most High God. Look where Saul is going to. Look what Saul denigrated and didn't even believe the words of the high priest. He believed the words of his henchman, Doeg, which were true, but he didn't go to find out the premise. He didn't care about the truth. He just wanted vengeance. He was so filled with wrath and taking out his vengeance for anyone who wronged him. And so he told the guards who stood there, turn about and kill the priests of Yahweh because their hand is with David. And but wow, what a thing this must have caused. It said here that but none of the servants, none of the soldiers would lift their hands against the priests. They stood there and they said, we're not doing it. We're not striking the priests of Yahweh. They feared God. And since no one would rise up, who does the king turn to? Verse 18, he turns to, and he says, Vayomer Hamelech Doeg, Le Doeg, turns to Doeg and says, Sob Ata um, Upagag, Upaga, and kill them and slay them, Upaga. And you see there is no hesitation there, no reservation from this guy, Doeg. He killed all the priests on that day, 85 of them. Men that were dedicated to God. He slew them, which again, this is just unthinkable. How, first of all, this man who, when we read about him in verse 8, he was in the sanctuary. He was where the temple of the Most High God was, and it says he was doing a service. Now, this really intrigued me because how could this guy who, 10 verses earlier had been in the house of God fulfilling a vow, in at least appearing to serve God, spending time there with the priests, in the presence of God, in the presence of these priests, suddenly just turn about and slay these people he had just spent time with. Uh, where was his relationship with God? He obviously didn't have one. Was he just pretending? Was it a spy mission all along? We really don't know, but it does strike a sad commentary of how someone can be in God's presence and going through religious motions, which we get from the previous verse that he had done this in the chapter, and that he then was able to just turn away and commit this horrible, horrible tragedy of killing 85 of the very men of God that he was once serving with. Um, can't imagine to even understand how any of this could happen, other than just the baseness of humanity on display. And kind of a sad note to end on, because even 19, verse 19, it gets worse. He went back to the city that the priest came from, and he killed all of them, from men and women, nursing infants, oxen, donkeys, sheeps. He killed all of them with the edge of the sword. What a terrible guy. What a terrible guy. It's also incredible to think that it was one against 85, that none of them resisted, that none of them tried to fight back, or, I'm trying to picture how this could happen. I mean, this is a mass casualty event of 85 people being slain with the sword and not being able to fight back. And then the same thing of how many innumerable people of the relatives, the women and children, of these priests, innocent people, dedicated their lives to God, slain, and everything they own destroyed by this horrible individual, Doeg, at the hand of the king of Israel, a fallen king, a decrepit ruler who is out of the favor of God, whose um, debaseness, and I'm trying to find the words to say of how horrible of a guy this was, that knew nothing was too low for him to do. And it's very sad commentating on humanity and what people are capable of when they turn away from God. So, a very sad note to leave on. We'll leave you with this, and we'll come back next week. The story will get better. I promise you that. So, God bless you all. Thanks so much for listening, and pray that God will richly bless you and encourage you this week. Bye bye.